Now, it's time for today's perspective on the programme, and it is a war in which tens of thousands of people have been killed, a war which has lasted for more than 17 years, the longest war, in fact, that the US has ever been involved in. And yet, despite the continuing deaths there are at least signs that the war in Afghanistan could, I repeat, could, be coming to an end. Now, the latest round of peace talks between the Taliban and the US broke up last week after lasting 16 days in Qatar. Although significant differences remain, with some of the key players, including, of course, the Afghan government, not even at the table, well, ways forward have been identified. So let's talk to Kamal Alam. He's Afghanistan analyst for the Institute for Statecraft. Thanks very much for being with us on the programme today. How can a peace process work when the Taliban are still carrying on with attacks? I mean, just this weekend, didn't we? We had a Taliban assault on checkpoints in the north of the country there, killing 22 troops.
I think, yeah, that's the point the Afghan government is making, that how can we have peace talks with a group that's fighting us, and the Americans have disregarded the Afghan government, and there's considerable tension between the Afghan government and the Americans on this. And we saw that in DC last week when the Afghan National Security Advisor publicly berated the Americans and said they're not taking us into confidence.
I mean, some might say it's not surprising. I mean, Ashraf Ghani, the president there, saying just a couple of months ago, more than 45,000 members of the security forces killed since he became president. Just bear in mind, of course, he only became president in 2014.
Yes, the Afghan security forces are taking huge losses on a daily basis. And I think this forms the crux of the argument. The Americans, as far as the Afghan government goes, are disrespecting them. And this whole war, 17 years, is about creating a stable, inclusive Afghan government. And if the Afghan government's not even going to be on the peace talks, it goes to show, as far as the Americans go, the Afghan government is irrelevant. So I think there's a contradiction there. And although we're talking about peace, I think it seems very unlikely, given that all the groups that did not support the Taliban before September 11th are still there. They formed the Afghan government. You've got the Afghan National Army, and they're not going to talk to the Taliban. So whatever the Americans do, the situation on the ground remains far from peaceful.
I mean, some might say at least they are talking. I mean, that's a start, isn't it?
I think it's a start as far as the Americans go, and this is all to do with President Trump having no interest. And even before he became president, he said this is a wasteful war, we must withdraw. And his exact statement 2 years ago was, against my better judgment, I'm sending more soldiers. That's, of course, to do with the former National Security Advisor, McMaster. So I think this is all about America and America's own audience, and that America just want, if not to withdraw, at least seeming to withdraw but for a solution. But as far as the situation on the ground goes, there is no talks between the Taliban or the Afghan government. They don't recognize the constitution. The Afghan government says that's non-negotiable. People are talking about a transitional government, but there's no clarity on this. The only clarity is that the Americans and the Taliban are talking. That's it. That's very different to what's happening on the ground.
But it sounds from what you're saying that actually you don't think there's any point in them talking, really.
I think, yes, if you're not going to take in the Afghan government, who are the legitimate representative of the people, the Afghan security forces, and I think this goes against the Charter of NATO. You've lost more than 2,000 NATO soldiers in Afghanistan in fighting the Taliban, and also trying to do capacity building of the Afghan army. As we speak, there are more than 5,000 NATO troops, and of course combined with the US as well, training Afghan forces. So, and even they're taking losses, of course not on the same scale of the Afghan. So how that plays out on a meaningful peace it just doesn't make any sense.
And why are the losses so heavy? Is it because the Afghan forces aren't really up to it, or is it just because the Taliban have become so good at tackling them?
I think it's a mixture of both. The Taliban are definitely very strong, and the Afghan security forces need more time. This is a country that's had 30 years of war, and they've been trying to rebuild. However, they've taken heavy losses. So it's a combination of not having the right structure in place, and at the same time, the confidence isn't there. And when you have the US saying we're going to talk to the Taliban directly, that doesn't give a lot of confidence to the Afghan security forces, who might then say, well, what's the point of us being here?
And do ordinary Afghanis see any point in these talks, do you think?
I think for the ordinary Afghan, any talks, at least which could lead to peace on the ground, are good. And And it must be said here that the Afghan government is far from perfect. There's been a lot of corruption. And in the far-flung villages and mountains, the Taliban have given swift justice. Now, that justice comes at a price. However, so one could argue that there might be a legitimate constituency for the Taliban. However, it's very limited. By and large, most of the Afghan population, I do not think they will welcome the Taliban, because Afghanistan has changed. This is not the Afghanistan of the 90s. It's a highly educated society in the big cities. There's been changes for women's rights, education, hospitals have changed. So I think it will take a big effort to convince the Afghan people. However, if the guns fall and people stop fighting, everyone will welcome it.
You mentioned Donald Trump and his campaign, some would say, to bring his troops back, not just from Afghanistan, also from other countries like Syria. And I know you also speak about Syria. I mean, how enormous could it be if Donald Trump follows through with those almost promises that he's made, although he has gone back on them a little bit, hasn't he, to bring all the troops back from the region?
I think, yes, President Trump has been very clear that he does not believe in these endless wars, unless there's a national security interest. In Syria, similarly, he was very clear that the U.S. doesn't really need to stay in Syria. The Russians or the Iranians can do what they want. Those were his exact words. So I think he's going to try his best. He's obviously coming up into elections, and he has a constituency. There's a part of the United States that believes, if not in total isolation, they only believe in what's good for America. And American troops trying in Afghanistan does not really serve their purpose, they feel. So I think they will try not to withdraw completely from Afghanistan, but they will reduce footprints, and that's what the negotiations are about. I think the Americans want a couple of bases. The Taliban is saying, we don't want you to have any bases. So even the talks between the Taliban and the US, they're far from easy. The Taliban won't acquiesce to US having bases in Afghanistan, whilst the US are very clear they want at least 1 or 2 air bases and military bases as they even leave Afghanistan.
Kamal Alam, thanks very much for being with us on the programme. Kamal Alam, Afghanistan analyst at the Institute for Statecraft. Thanks very much. That was today's perspective here on France 24.